Something wrong, officer?
Yeah. Got a taillight out.
Where?
Right there.
You know, one day honest citizens are gonna stand up to you crooked cops.
They are? Oh, no. Have they set a date? Hey, come to think of it, she did. Well, she didn't reckon with the awesome power of the chief of police. Now, where did I put my badge? Hey, that duck's got it. Oh, come on, give it back. I need it. Oh, keep it.
Hi everyone, it's Ruby G.
And I'm Joff.
Welcome to Truth in Neurons.
Let's find the blind spots. Military culture and civilian law enforcement create psychological dynamics that can profoundly shape how investigations unfold, particularly in small-town departments where military veterans constitute a significant portion of the force. Understanding these dynamics isn't about impugning individual officers' integrity, it's about recognizing how institutional culture shapes perception, decision-making, and the interpretation of evidence in ways that can create systematic blind spots.
Military training fundamentally restructures how individuals process information and make decisions. Unlike civilian life, where questioning authority and independent critical thinking are generally valued, military culture operates on a strict hierarchical model where chain of command is sacred. Orders flow downward, compliance flows upward. This structure serves crucial functions in combat environments where split-second coordination can mean the difference between life and death. Soldiers are trained to trust their commanding officer's judgment, to execute orders without prolonged deliberation, and to suppress individual doubts in favour of unit coercion.
When veterans transition into law enforcement, particularly in leadership positions, these deeply ingrained patterns don't simply disappear. The psychological architecture built through years of military service, where questioning a superior's assessment could be seen as insubordination, where loyalty to the unit takes precedence over individual concerns, where maintaining a unified front is paramount, carries over into investigative contexts. In a high-profile murder investigation, when a chief or senior investigator declares confidence in a particular theory or suspect, subordinate officers may feel psychological pressure to align with that narrative rather than voice contradictory observations.
An officer who notices forensic anomalies that don't fit the official timeline, or who has information suggesting multiple perpetrators rather than a lone wolf, faces a psychological dilemma. Bringing such concerns forward means implicitly questioning leadership judgment, potentially undermining department cohesion, and marking oneself as disloyal or difficult. In military-influenced cultures, these are significant social and professional costs. The path of least psychological resistance is to rationalise away the discrepancies, to trust that the leadership has information justifying their confidence, to maintain unit solidarity rather than introducing discord.
This dynamic intensifies under external pressure. When a case attracts national media attention, when the public demand answers, and when institutional credibility is at stake, the psychological incentive to present a unified, confident narrative becomes overwhelming. Doubt becomes disloyalty. Questioning becomes destabilisation. The very traits that make military veterans valuable officers, discipline, decisiveness, commitment to mission, can paradoxically create environments where contradictory evidence gets minimised because it threatens narrative coherence and institutional solidarity.
Military service creates extraordinary strong in-group bonds. Veterans describe fellow service members as brothers and sisters. Relationships forged through shared hardship, mutual dependence, and collective identity that transcends normal friendship. This intense group cohesion is psychologically adaptive in military contexts. It motivates soldiers to risk their lives for each other, creates trust under extreme conditions, and provides emotional resilience against trauma.
But in-group solidarity necessarily creates its mirror image, out-group distance. Social psychology research consistently demonstrates that strong in-group identification correlates with preferential treatment of in-group members and harsher judgment of out-group members. When law enforcement officers with military backgrounds serve in small communities, their in-group often expands to include other veterans, local families with military traditions, and community members seen as respectable or aligned with law enforcement values, which in college towns frequently includes established Greek organisations, athletes, and students from prominent local families.
Let's see now. Bulletin. New race discovered. Living 6 inches under Denver.
Oh, Dad.
All named Morton. Or Mortensen.
My name is Stanley Mortensen, and I've lived in North Idaho for quite some time. I come from a long line of Idahoans. I was not born in Idaho. My dad joined the Marines and left Idaho and had me while he was serving the federal government. But in the 90s, I moved to Idaho, and I've been here for a long time. And my wife and I have 8 children. We've more or less raised our children in North Idaho and Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls, and we love this area. When I was 21, I got hired as a sheriff's deputy, and I was a sheriff's deputy here for 8 years, both in the detention and patrol. So for 8 years, I served the citizens of North Idaho and protected the Constitution. And after 8 years as a sheriff's deputy, I decided to go to law school, see where that took me. And after law school, I started teaching criminal justice as an assistant professor for 1.5 years, and then I started prosecuting, and I've been prosecuting now for about 10 years, and most of that has been here with Kootenai County Prosecutor's Office. And I'm a felony prosecutor, so I handle some of the more violent and serious crimes. And one of the things that's interested in me in becoming a judge is, as a deputy sheriff, there were times where I had arrested the same person multiple times. And I think if you talk to a lot of the officers and deputies, you'll get the same response out of them. Sometimes you deal with the same people, and sometimes the same families. Sometimes it's the children of the parents of the people you're dealing with.
When potential suspects or witnesses come from perceived in-group local students from good families, fraternity members, individuals with family connections to law enforcement or military, officers may unconsciously process their statements charitably, giving them the benefit of doubt more readily, and be less inclined to pursue aggressive questioning. Outsiders, particularly someone like Brian Koberger, a graduate student from out of state with no local connections, studying criminology, which can trigger competitive suspicion among officers, become psychologically easier to cast as suspects because they don't activate the in-group protection response. The Moscow community itself is small, tight-knit, with generational families and interconnected social networks. Officers who grew up there, whose children attend the university, who socialise with parents of students involved in Greek life, operate within overlapping social circles, and create conflicts of loyalty even when formal conflicts of interest don't exist. An investigation that seriously pursued the multiple perpetrator theory, that examined whether students from prominent local families or established fraternities might be involved, would require officers to potentially target the children of neighbours, friends, or community pillars. The psychological resistance to pursuing such lines of inquiry, not through conscious corruption, but through unconscious bias toward protecting perceived in-group members, can be substantial.
Military culture's emphasis on protecting the team can extend to protecting community reputation. A lone wolf intruder narrative contains the damage. One monster infiltrated and harmed the community, but the community itself remains good. A multiple perpetrator scenario involving local students, particularly if it implicated Greek culture or suggested institutional failures in university oversight, would indict the community itself. The motivation to avoid that conclusion, to preserve the community's self-image and external reputation, operates powerfully, even when not consciously acknowledged. Military training systematically desensitizes service members to violence through necessary exposure and combat preparation. Soldiers learn to compartmentalize violence, to view it as a tool rather than a moral catastrophe, to maintain operational effectiveness in environments saturated with trauma. They're trained to operate in contexts where violence isn't unusual but routine, where aggression is channeled and controlled rather than suppressed. This training serves vital purposes for military effectiveness and psychological survival in combat zones. However, this relationship to violence can affect how officers interpret civilian crime scenes. What might shock or emotionally overwhelm someone without military experience might register differently for combat veterans, not because they lack empathy, but because their psychological baseline for violence has been fundamentally altered. The extreme brutality of the Idaho 4 murders, involving multiple stab wounds, significant trauma, must have been extraordinarily violent and chaotic, and may be processed through a framework shaped by exposure to combat violence.
This altered framework, officers with combat experience might bring valuable composure and analytical clarity to scenes that would emotionally encapsulate others. On one hand, violence should register as requiring multiple perpetrators because of the coordination needed. The sustained aggression involved, or the logistics of controlling multiple victims, might seem more plausible as a solo act to someone whose reference points include combat scenarios where individual soldiers engage multiple enemies. Violence that serves legitimate tactical purposes within rules of engagement can create interpretive schemas where violence gets categorized as either legitimate, controlled, or illegitimate, uncontrolled. This binary can lead investigators to underestimate how violence that appears organized or tactical, such as attacks that show evidence of planning or coordination, might actually stem from group dynamics within civilian social contexts like fraternity culture. The framework for understanding collective violence in military contexts, squad-based operations, unit coercion under fire, doesn't necessarily translate well to understanding collective violence in civilian contexts, such as group crimes emerging from social rivalry.
These psychological dynamics don't operate in isolation. They interact with institutional pressures that exist in any high-profile investigation. The Moscow Police Department, unaccustomed to cases attracting international scrutiny, faced enormous pressure to demonstrate competence, decisiveness, and progress. In my opinion, they failed horribly. In military-influenced cultures, responding to pressure typically means projecting confidence, maintaining unified messaging, and executing a clear operational plan rather than acknowledging uncertainty or exploring multiple complex scenarios. The timeline of the investigation reflects this. Relatively early public confidence that they were following leads, the eventual focus on Koberger, and the subsequent framing of the case as essentially solved, despite significant evidentiary gaps. This confidence might reflect genuine investigative conclusions, but it might also reflect institutional psychology shaped by culture, where admitting uncertainty is seen as weakness, where changing course looks like failure, and where the mission once defined must be executed decisively.
The question isn't whether individual officers are honourable, but whether the institutional culture they operate within creates systemic blind spots that can lead competent, well-intentioned investigators toward incomplete or incorrect conclusions.
In the Idaho 4 case, understanding these dynamics doesn't prove alternative theories correct, but it does suggest why certain investigative paths might have been pursued more aggressively than others, and why a multiple perpetrator scenario involving local students might have been psychologically harder for investigators to seriously entertain than a lone wolf outsider narrative, regardless of where the evidence actually points.
That's all for today's episode of Truth and Neurons. If you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the ethics of media commentary in high-profile cases. Until next time, keep thinking critically and questioning everything. Cheers, bye.